Your histamine bucket is overflowing, and it's not because you're eating the wrong things. You probably already tried to fix that, but it's because the histamine drain may be blocked. I'm Dr. Kenny Middlestat, an IFM certified functional medicine practitioner, and this is one of the common patterns that I see in practice, people who are trying to do the right things for their histamine reactions and still can't get clear reads on what to do next. Here's what that cycle is actually telling you. The diet itself was never the fundamental problem. And when the underlying system doesn't have the capacity to clear histamine efficiently, restriction from your diet becomes a management strategy instead of a resolution and a long-term solution. In this video, we're going to look at the clearance side of the histamine equation and why it breaks down, what keeps it suppressed even when you're doing all of the right things, and where to start when the obvious answers have already stopped working. Picture this experience that you might recognize. You went low histamine diet, and your symptoms may have gotten better for a short period of time, whether it was headaches or skin issues or your gut settled down a little bit. You thought, finally, I figured it out. This low histamine thing is the bee's knees. And then 6 months later, after feeling a bit better, you start reacting again. Maybe you added certain foods back in, maybe you didn't, maybe there was a major life event in your life, and you go back to avoiding foods and maybe even more foods than before, and it has a different effect. Here's what that pattern and that cycle that many people get stuck in is telling you. The diet worked because it reduced your input. It lowered the total amount of histamine that was coming in, especially from the external sources. But the clearance side, the system that's supposed to process and eliminate histamine effectively, didn't actually get rebuilt or supported in a long-term strategy way. It just got retested down the road, and those two things are not the same. When you add foods back in, or when your daily stressors push more histamine into the system, you run right back to the same process and the same ceiling that you hit before. The ceiling itself never changed. The pressure on the system underneath it did. So that's the pattern. And once you see it, the question stops being, what else do I need to avoid? Which is unfortunately where many food-first approaches go, and starts being, why can't my body clear what it used to be able to handle? Most conversations about histamine intolerance focus almost entirely on what goes in to try and change the situation. The foods, the triggers, the supplements, all of these different things. But histamine intolerance is, at its core, a two-sided equation. What comes in and what your body can actually process are the two main things. Your body has two main enzymes that support this histamine clearance or breakdown side. The first is DAO, or diamine oxidase. This is an enzyme that works outside of your cells, primarily in your gut lining. Think of it as the bouncer of the club at the door, and it catches histamine before it crosses into the bloodstream from the gut. The second is HNMT. This is histamine N-methyltransferase. And this works inside the cells, primarily in your liver and your lungs, as well as in your brain, which is why you can have symptoms just about anywhere. And this one handles histamine that's already made it through and into the bloodstream from the gut. It works by tagging histamine for elimination, and it does so by adding a little chemical marker called a methyl group. We can talk more about methylation later, and that flags it for breakdown and processing. Two enzymes, two different locations, two completely different sets of upstream dependencies that determine how effective they are. Here's what gets missed when people supplement with DAO from the outside, or they take quercetin to stabilize mast cells, for instance. Those can be very useful tools, but they're working around a clearance problem rather than addressing what's creating it. The question worth asking first is, why did this capacity drop in the first place? And that answer almost always comes back to something that's happening further upstream in our chemistry. It's not the enzyme itself, it's the environment that the enzyme is working in. DAO does not live and work in isolation, just like many biochemical products in our bodies. It lives in the cells in your small intestine, and specifically in mature cells that live in the intestinal villi. These are the little finger-like projections that give your gut its enormous surface area for absorption. So imagine that your gut lining is a field of grass, and each blade is an intestinal villi or villus. DAO lives at the tip of each of these blades, and it's always there. It's synthesized as part of normal gut function. It's released into the gut during digestion. But when that field is damaged or inflamed, or when the tips become eroded by inflammation from various issues, hidden infections, for some people gluten or dairy, the list goes on, your DAO output actually drops. It's not necessarily because of a permanent genetic defect, although some people do have those predispositions, but it's because the cells that make DAO are not healthy enough to produce it at the rate that your system needs to play catch up. A foundational research review of histamine breakdown established that DAO activity directly reflects the health of your intestinal lining. The more inflamed or damaged that lining is, the less DAO your body produces. And what that means for you is that your clearance rate or capacity suffers. And it's a very real-time readout of what's going on in your gut health broadly. So the question for people with lower DAO isn't just, do I have low DAO, which is what the tests look for, but the more useful question becomes, why is my gut lining producing less of it? And stay with me here, because this is also where it gets quite interesting. Another recent article in 2018 found that patients with histamine intolerance showed elevated levels of zonulin on a stool test. Zonulin is a marker that's general, non-specific, but represents how the gut lining has likely become more permeable than it should be, aka leaky gut. They also showed reduced diversity in the microbiome, which of course is a protective factor. And specifically, there was elevated proteobacterial species compared to healthy controls. What this suggests is that both gut dysbiosis, or imbalances in the microbiome, and intestinal barrier disruption may be actively driving the problems associated with impaired DAO activity and thus histamine intolerance. This study was observational data, so it's important to know that we're looking at associations, not any confirmed causation, but it's consistent with what I see in practice as well, and that data is still information. And here's where it compounds further. A more recent 2022 study found that people with histamine intolerance didn't just have different microbiome compositions. They had a significantly higher abundance of the histamine secreting bacteria. This is species like Staphylococcus, Clostridium perfringens, and Enterococcus faecalis, which were overrepresented in patients on average. And the bacteria that are associated with protective factors or good gut health, including Faecalibacterium, as well as Ruminococcus and Prevotella, were lower. So less of the protective organisms were available in these patients on average as well. Here's the problem with that, is that dysbiosis is working against you in both directions at the same time. The inflamed mucosal environment is suppressing DAO production, so that enzyme is clearly impaired. But the bacterial imbalance is simultaneously producing more histamine from the inside. And that just adds to the load and compounds the already suppressed enzyme function that it has to manage. So your input is going up in two different ways, and the clearance capacity is going down. And that gap between those two is where many people's symptoms and high state of reactivity live. That is fundamentally not a problem that you can simply solve with a food list. So if you've tried the restrictive diets and had this experience, I want you to truly hear that. Food is powerful, but it is not the only thing to consider in holistic healing. So now let's bring our attention to the methylation side of the equation. That's the full DAO picture that we talked about, but the second enzyme, the HNMT, brings an entirely different set of requirements into this. The first chemical that we're going to talk about is called SAM, or you may see it as SAMe on the shelves. It stands for S-adenosyl methionine. Think of SAM like a shared resource pool. Your methylation cycle, it's a biochemical process that basically runs using things like B vitamins as raw material, produces this SAM constantly in our bodies. And every process in your body that requires methylation draws from this same pool of available resources. So detoxifying environmental compounds, regulating your mood chemistry, even supporting DNA repair and breaking down your hormones to clear from the body. These are all processes that rely on methylation. HNMT draws from that same pool specifically to tag histamine for breakdown. But it's not the only process that is competing for that supply. When the pool runs low, from B vitamin depletion to chronic stress, even immune systems that have been burning through resources, HNMT gets less of what it needs, and histamine that is already inside your cells doesn't get cleared the way that it should. This is why nutrients like B2, methylfolate, B12, and magnesium, they're not optional supporting actors in this picture. They are the raw materials that your methylation cycle needs to keep this pool replenished. And if you have a genetic backdrop as well, this can make these processes less efficient. When that pool becomes depleted, and they deplete quickly under chronic stress or chronic inflammation or gut dysbiosis, to bring it back to the first underlying cause, HNMT becomes a bottleneck, even when your gut lining is in a decent shape. And the big point here, too, is that you can have both clearance pathways compromised at the same time through two completely different upstream mechanisms. And that's what root cause work is all about. DAO can be suppressed by gut inflammation. HNMT can be slowed by a depleted methylation pool. And neither of those shows up on a standard food sensitivity panel or conventional lab work or otherwise. And by the way, if you want a broken down written summary of the research that I've used for this particular video, I've included a link to a free research summary. It's in the pinned comment in the description below. It includes the citations as well as my short take on these studies, so check it out. Here's a question that I often ask my patients in my first conversation with them that are dealing with histamine type issues. When did you notice it get worse? And was there something happening in your life at the time? It could be a period of high stress, whether you perceive it or not, an infection, a major life change, a health event. Almost without exception, there's an answer that correlates to the time this all began. Not always the same answer for each person, but there is a moment. And it's usually a moment where the body's total inflammatory load or stress load, called your allostatic load, went up and it significantly or stayed elevated. From a systems-based functional medicine perspective, this makes a lot of sense. Chronic low-grade inflammation doesn't just cause symptoms. It actively suppresses clearance, and it does so on both sides of the equation. It damages the gut lining, which is a main immune system and inflammation interface in our bodies, and therefore DAO production drops. That drop means histamine that enters from food isn't being cleared the way that it needs to be as well. But at the same time, the inflammatory state is also competing for the same B vitamins and the methyl donors that the HNMT enzyme depends on. So the immune system burns through those resources, and histamine produced on the inside doesn't even get cleared as effectively. And this whole situation keeps mast cells in a more reactive and red alert state, which means even more histamine is likely being released independent of what you're eating. So again, that's not a diet problem. That is a systems resilience problem. And I'm curious, for those of you who have been dealing with a problem just like this, when you have that lowered resilience and high reactivity, what was happening in your life at the time? Your histamine symptoms in particular became hard to manage. Was there high stress or an illness or a new medication or a major life change or event? Drop it in the comments below. I do read every one of them, and it may help others to see their story and yours. So where does this entire concept leave a person who's already done the dietary work and is still reacting? Without understanding what is suppressing your clearance capacity, the investigation stops at the wrong question. You keep asking what to take away instead of what to look at, and maybe what your body is also asking for. And you can keep removing foods indefinitely without ever addressing this ceiling. We're trying to move from what do I avoid simply to what is suppressing my clearance capacity and what does it depend on. In practice, I'm usually looking for when someone comes in with this pattern and it's the moment that their inflammatory load changed and what's been sustaining it ever since. Histamine intolerance can be a vicious cycle. And so understanding where the disruptions are for each individual person is one of the most important things you can take a step back and do. And so that question, what's been sustaining it since, points to deeper questions in the gut lining or the microbiome or functional vitamin B status, or even total inflammatory and immune burden on the body. Those aren't things that are being tested on a standard panel that you go and see your conventional practitioner or even many specialists for. They require a different set of data points and different questions fundamentally. And if you've ever been told that your labs look normal while you're experiencing perhaps the worst health you've experienced, which many people with histamine intolerance say that they've never experienced anything like it, what I want you to hear and understand deeply is that normal labs and a suppressed histamine clearance system are not mutually exclusive. They're asking fundamentally different questions. A standard lab panel does not get into DAO or assess the gut mucosal integrity or even evaluate functional methylation status. This is not a criticism of any individual provider, but it is a gap in what standard evaluation looks for by default. Stark disease states that are defined, treatable, and matchable to an algorithmic intervention. If you're deeply resonating with this and wondering what that investigation looks like for your specific case, I offer an application for a free health mystery map call. There's a link in the description, and if you're in one of the states I practice in, I would love to have a conversation with you. When it comes to the histamine drain concern, you cannot shrink that gap by reducing your inputs alone. Not if the clearance side has structural problems or deficiency problems that are not being addressed. And those structural problems, the gut lining, the microbiome terrain, the methylation pool, the list goes on, they don't self-correct from dietary restriction in particular. They need their own investigation in the right order. Now, what this video hasn't addressed is what keeps that inflammatory load elevated in the first place. What keeps your mast cells in their hyperreactive state? Or after the original trigger has even passed? That's a different question, and it has a different answer. If you've noticed that your reactivity seems to track with stress or environmental exposures or moments that have nothing to do with what you ate, the MCAS video linked here goes through the 7 root cause patterns that I look for when the immune system has stopped recalibrating on its own. So check that out. I'm Dr. Kenny, Root Cause Health Detective. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.